All right, how's it going, y'all? So I made a video a couple days ago that's actually kind of making people really angry for some reason. It's funny when you make a video that kind of explains some experimentation that you're doing, like people seem to get really upset about it. But I wanted to kind of share with you the different state management libraries that exist in React and kind of give my opinions on which ones I like using, which ones I don't like using. So there's Redux, there's Redux Toolkit, there's Zustan, there is Mobx, there's Jotoi, or I don't know how to pronounce this. Jody? I don't know. Someone can probably let me know how it works. But you have all these different ways to basically manage state in React. Which one's the best? Who really knows? They're all just different preferences, right? So the first thing you need to understand as a programmer is that like everyone has different viewpoints and perspectives and stances on like how stuff should be done, which is why there's so much diversity, which is great, right? There's tons of different tools, and some of these tools are better than others for certain use cases, right? So for my like little MVC approach that I was kind of doing, I guess I'll even talk about this as well and kind of explain why I would be doing this. All right, there's also like React context. Okay, let's just go ahead and look at React context. And these are the different ways you can kind of take state and move it to a place that makes it more globally available for other components, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is like, why do we have state management libraries? Because if you just use React, like you have this use state hook that you can potentially use, and you kind of wonder like, why do we have all these different ways to basically do the same thing, right? So if you just use the typical approach of just like saying use state, so like const count, set count like this, use state. If you just do this approach, this works fine for a lot of cases, right? So this is like the first thing that you should probably do, especially if you're a beginner, if you're building out a smaller application. And there's nothing wrong with this, but the issue is that sometimes you need to have this state shared amongst multiple components, right? You might have a parent component. That parent component has multiple children. Those children might have subchildren. And you need these subchildren to access this count variable, right? This count state. Or maybe you need to allow those children to update them. So the only way to do that using the use state is you have to actually pass it in as props. So like, let's just pretend this thing needed access to count. Well, I have to pass it here. And then I have to also pass it set count if for whatever reason the title needed to change the count. And then if you looked at the title component and dived into it, let's say that needed to pass those things even further down. So this is called prop drilling, where you take some properties and you push them further and further and further down the component tree. In fact, let me just load up Excel real quick, because I think it makes more sense to like just kind of talk about this. So if you imagine React, it has like a tree, right? If you know what a tree data structure is, it kind of looks like this. And I know my boxes are kind of all over the place, but you have like a main component here, and that component has children. And those children are composed of even more children like this. So that's basically how React and all these component libraries work, is that you have like this main page component, and that page component is comprised of smaller components that might have their own internal state, and that state might be shared amongst other components. So for example, let's say we had a header here. I'll just say like a header. Actually, let's just say like main app. And then let's say we had a header here that needs to display like the username, and that header is broken up into like a logo component, and then maybe like a account component as well. Also have like a welcome screen here, welcome, and then that has like a user welcome message like this. All right, so you have a welcome page that maybe displays like a welcome message like, oh, how's it going, Bob? Welcome to this app. Give me your credit card and give us some money. What you can do, or traditionally what happens if you need to share state, like if the header has to display Bob somewhere, so display Bob is the use case. I need to display the string of Bob somewhere in the header, but then I also need to display Bob over here, like so. The only way to achieve that is you have to take like your state and you have to move it from like where it might be here and here. You have to move it all the way up here to the main app so that you can do prop drilling to pass it all the way through these components. And if you can imagine the amount of properties that you're passing, right? That's like two components here that you have to basically prop drill this thing into. And then also down here, that's two extra things. So you're basically going through all your components, the signatures of your components here, and you're saying like name and potentially set name or something. I mean, you might not have set name in that instance, but you might just have like a, right? I'll say like account name. So for every single component that was kind of demonstrated in Excel, you're going to be making an account name inside the functional properties that you have to like pass that around. So that's the one pain of prop drilling. It's not necessarily bad. I think prop drilling allows you to quickly see where things are coming from, which is a benefit. It's just a little bit tedious to have to like keep on defining this stuff. And it's just kind of your personal preference. If you don't want to have to do all this, then what you can do is you can bring in a state management library, or you can use something like context so that you can actually have this state defined. Again, it's still defined at a higher level or defined even outside of React. But now your components don't have to pass that stuff all the way through all the components with prop drilling. They can just access that thing directly like this, right? So this thing, I mean, like you could have this defined with context. And if you were to do context, like you define your context and wrap everything here basically by using like a provider. And then inside the context itself, you would actually store that name of Bob, right? So this would store Bob here. And we could still like display Bob wherever we wanted to inside of these children. But we've reduced the necessity of doing a bunch of prop drilling everywhere, which again isn't necessarily bad. It's just kind of tedious. So you have to kind of look at your use cases. Is like, is the prop drilling causing more confusion? Is it causing more complexity? Or sometimes I have issues with context because you have this provider that's wrapping everything. And now any of these components, literally all of these things can update and grab the name of Bob and change Bob, right? So if you have a so if you have a really large like component tree, any of those things that are inside the context provider have access to change Bob. And when one of these changes it by accident, you don't know, right? That brings us to my next point of why was Redux created? Which again, like Redux, instead of using context, we have like this Redux thing here. I'll just say like Redux. And Redux is like a more fully fledged state management library where you can kind of pull out all of your logic and keep it in this like Redux library. But again, like typically if you're using like Redux Toolkit or something, you use something called use selector hooks, where you can still store Bob in like a Redux store. But now inside of all your code, you would just basically say like use selector, and then I'll say like state dot name or something. Now, again, like I haven't used Redux in a while, so the syntax might not be exact, but that's kind of the idea. Like if you need to display Bob here and then Bob over here, you would use a selector, which is basically going to take that Bob variable, which is like here, or this Bob state, and I'm going to pull it directly into my components like that using a selector. Redux is kind of taking it to the next level too, because they have a bunch of ways to send off or dispatch something called actions. So if you wanted to have Redux kind of hit like an API, get some data, and then when the result comes back, you can have that update Bob. You can do that with like thunks and stuff. I just find Redux really complicated and over-engineered for a majority of cases. But I think Redux was really popular back before hooks like got big, which is why people use it. But I don't know. I've looked at projects that use Redux, and it's like there's so much indirection with your code because you basically decoupled and you're using like event-driven programming to send off and dispatch actions, and it's hard to know what's being called and where it's being called, which is why with Redux they have like an actual like Chrome extension that helps you understand it because it's so complicated in my opinion. So this is one approach with Redux. There's like Zustan as well. And all the other state management libraries basically do the same approach. There's typically like you have to have some type of Zustan provider that wraps your app or something, or you have to have some type of hook that you're calling. And you'll see this pattern used for like all the different state management libraries. So that's kind of why we use state management. If you ever have to share state between your components, there is a time and a tool and a place where you might want to reach out and use something like Zustan or Mobx. Or if you need to basically decouple your view logic from your actual like presentation logic, or decouple your view from your presentation logic, you can use one of these as well. And that kind of achieves the same thing. All right, so going back, let's just look at some of these state management libraries. So Redux, we talked about Redux, although I don't think this is the right website. I clicked on the wrong link here. So we got Redux. You've probably seen Redux where you have to read through all these docs. It's pretty complicated. You basically create a component, you map that to your Redux store, and then you can kind of dispatch events and listen for those things using like a connect method. Let's see. Do we have any good examples? Why use Redux? Quick start. Let's just look at the quick start real quick. And again, the goal of this video is just to kind of expose you to new things. Because a lot of the comments I get for that MVC thing I did, like people think that I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Trust me, I've read through all these things. I know what they do. I understand that there's something called Zustan out there. I don't know if their docs show you the Redux Toolkit way. They might. But this is like the syntax, right? You create this thing called a slice where you have some initial state, and then you have to use reducers to basically change that state. And I believe behind the scenes, they're using like Immer to allow you to do mutating logic. Because honestly, like immutable code sucks. It's just bad DX in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. So don't get mad when I say that. But it allows you to basically have a bunch of reducers where you call some methods from your components, you dispatch actions. Those actions are going to invoke these methods that's going to modify your state. Okay, and then later on in your views, you can actually like use those stores by saying like use selector, and you can grab the counter from your Redux store like this, and then you can display it on your page, right? So this is more of an example of the view where you've decoupled your view layer from your presentation logic, right? So everything exists in Redux, or you can use Redux that like that if you want to, where your UI is basically just dispatching actions. Your Redux store or your slice or whatever is listening for those actions. It's going to do some logic, and then you can kind of re-update the UI based on what's changed in state. So this is good. I think this is pretty testable as well. Like this is all separated from React, I believe. So I think it's pretty easy to like write a unit test over this, which is cool. I just don't like how like in order to do asynchronous stuff, I just don't like Redux. I'll be honest with you. There's just a lot of boilerplate. I know Redux Toolkit like took it to the next level and made it a little bit more easy. But like if you want to do asynchronous actions, like I believe you have to do some weird stuff. I don't know if I'm even looking at Redux Toolkit. Is this the same page? React Redux Toolkit. I don't know. It's funny. Like everyone basically ended up disliking Redux and calling it over-engineered, so they created something called Redux Toolkit that is built on top of Redux to try to make it better in terms of like developer experience. But again, you like read through all these docs, it's just so much extra stuff that you have to understand. I don't like how like your reducers can't share state between other reducers. At least that's how I remember it when I used it a while back. Maybe you can do that now. But like it makes sense to have your global state accessible by other actions, in my opinion. Right now, they create this isolated approach where like this slice can't read any other state from other slices, I believe, and it has to be like passed in. Anyway, let's see if I can find like the async stuff. There's like something called thunk, which you have to use for dispatching asynchronous actions. But yeah, I mean, it's just another preference. Like if this is the way you like doing it, I do like how you can use mutatable code in Redux Toolkit. I'm a big fan of mutating state. I think it's just easier to read and easier to understand. But all this other stuff, like I'm just not a fan of. It's just a lot of extra stuff. Now let's move on to something more simplistic like Zustan. So Zustan's another library you can use to manage state, where you basically create something similar. It's like a slice, but it's just like a little object that has state and it has methods. And you can use this anywhere in your application to either change your state or update your state or render your state, right? So an example is you make this little Zustan create function that's going to give you a custom hook. You can use that custom hook in your React components like so, and I can actually render out the bear's number here inside of my component. So it's pretty straightforward. And then if I ever wanted to increment or decrement these bears, I could just use the bear store. I can get the increase population method, and then I can just on click, I can call it. So again, like we're decoupling the view logic, right? We're extracting the logic from the view and we're putting it in some type of external thing, right? So there's a big benefit to Zustan as well. I think the DX for this kind of is wonky. Like if you read through all this, it's a lot of extra stuff you have to read through, and it's a lot of cognitive overhead in my opinion, which is why I don't really like Zustan. It's the simplest state management out there, I believe, so it's good. But that's kind of why I was kind of doing my own MVC approach, because it's like all these approaches, there's just a lot of boilerplate that's involved with all of it. Like, why do we have to do all this stuff to create a simple way to store variables? why do we have to call like all these additional methods just to update a simple thing like bears? So let's move on to another one. I'm not saying Zustan's not bad. Like Zustan's pretty cool. It's just not my preference. Now let's move on to, like, maybe they have a way to like use Emmer here. They probably do. But yeah, like you look at this syntax. It's like just to change Lush, you have to call set. And then if you want to use Emmer, you have to call produce. Just so you can do this. It's like, why do you have to do all these extra stuff just to change the variable? Like, it's ridiculous. But I'm going to try to keep this video positive because I don't want to bash libraries because it seems like it angers a lot of viewers. So Mobx is another cool one where you can kind of create this class which has methods, and those methods modify state. So this one is probably the closest to what I would like to use. It kind of meets my philosophies and meets my preferences where you can just modify variables, right? It's straightforward. You call a method, you can increment that variable, you can decrement that variable. I'm not a big fan of the class keyword in the this everywhere. I try to avoid the this keyword at all costs because I think it just causes a bunch of extra confusion. But that's just me. I mean, it's not hard to learn this. It's just one more thing that, like, there's been a lot of bugs in the past I've encountered because of this, and I'm sure other developers can vouch for the same thing. This can be very confusing depending on where the this is called and like what's calling the this. But this is basically the syntax of it. You make this timer thing, you create that, and now you have this like global state that you can access from any of your components. And then to use it, you call this observer method, and you basically wrap your view with this observer that gives you access to a timer. And in order to basically pass that timer in, you have to do this. Again, like this works pretty good, but like this whole part seems kind of confusing and convoluted. I mean, it's not that many extra steps. Like you make a component that takes in a timer, you have to wrap it and observe, and then you pass it your Mobx timer class here. Make sure you make the thing observable with this thing. It's just, I don't know. There's boilerplate involved with every library. But if I had to pick, I think I'd probably pick Mobx because it's like the closest to like what I would like to do. Now there's this other one. I don't even know how to pronounce this, but I haven't actually used this that much. But basically you have something called like atoms and use atoms, and you can like define like really basic states that you need to basically update or render out in the view. So in this case, if you're using jot.oi, you guys can make fun of me in the comments for not knowing how to pronounce this thing. But you make an atom, and then you can basically pass that atom some type of callback here to change the state of the atom, I believe. So uppercase atom. All right, so I guess this is like a derived state. I haven't really actually used this yet. I need to kind of try it out, but looks like you make an atom and it gives you the ability to do a traditional like setter and getter here. And then whenever someone changes an input, we can just set the text on that atom. And now that thing is kind of globally available for any other component. So down here in this uppercase component, we can bring in that derived uppercase atom, which is going to basically wrap this atom and make the text that the user typed in all to uppercase. So I don't know if there's like a code pin I can kind of just demonstrate that, but that works pretty cool. I don't know if they have like something that's more complex with like a bunch of different methods on it, but it seems like it's basically just allowing you to say like use state, but you have it at a global level that anywhere in your application can use. I need to read through this one. I don't think I've actually read much about it. Primitive, it's a basic interface like use state, okay. And then derived atoms can combine other atoms and enable use reducer style with side effects. So yeah, I don't know. I don't see a big benefit of having like individual things you can store in state, especially when it comes to testing, because like you need to test all these things together. But let me not bash this one. I haven't really tried it. But it's pretty cool. I mean, I wish they, let's see what they say for testing. Yeah, I don't know. Let's just move on. So there's also context I kind of talked about where you create like a context using use context. There's a hook called use context that you create. And then it gives you back a context object that has like a dot provider on it. So when you do use context, actually I'm explaining this wrong. There's a react.create context which creates a context object. That context object has a provider on it, and then you have to basically wrap your React components at a higher level to allow other children of that component to be able to call use context and basically pass in the context. So this is another approach. If you ever need to do any type of like dependency injection or pull up state to a higher level, you can use context, and then you can just change that or bring that in children and do whatever you need with that context value, right? So this is generic. You can kind of store whatever you want in it. In this case, he is storing an object that looks like this in the context. So that gives him access to basically grab the theme background and theme foreground. And then I believe you could easily add whatever you want here. You could add setters, you could add functions. So context is cool. I don't have any gripes about context. Sometimes you want something that's not so like, you know, having to wrap everything is kind of a pain with context. I'm not a big fan of that. I'd rather use something like Zustan where I just have like this global place. I can easily just update stuff. Or even this approach with like these atoms, that works pretty cool. But those are some of the overviews of like the different state management libraries. I'm sure I missed some. There's like tons of things out there. Like the one I use at work is called Cerebral Js, which is a state management library that basically allows you to keep all of your logic completely out of your Vue components or your React components. And you have like this global state tree that you can basically set up the state that you need in your entire application. And then later you can like modify those. So like if I were to go to, there's like something called sequences here where you have your state, you have your methods that you can call to modify the state. And then when you call these things, you basically, modify the state using mutatable code. And those things are called like sequences, and sequences are made up of actions. So like, it gets pretty complex, but it's really powerful and it helps your code become really clean because it's all declarative. So this is the approach that we use on our project at work. The only issue with Cerebral is that there's not really a maintainer anymore. I believe the maintainer moved on to other cooler things like a state machine library or something. But we've used this, and like our application at work is really testable and it's really easy to like add stuff and remove stuff, I believe. There's another one that is created by the same maintainer called Overmind Js, which is a very similar approach where you basically define like a global state tree. And this global state tree has actions that you can kind of use to change the state of your state tree. And you also have the ability to do effects. So like you can make your actions, talk to third-party libraries, etc. But again, the goal of Overmind and Cerebral is like to have all your presentation logic live outside of your rendered components, like outside of your React view, basically, which kind of allows for better testing and like, keep your logic separated. So all these things I talked about, like the reason I'm bringing this up is because that one video I published and I talked about my MVC approach. This approach is a combination of some of the things that I think work best for me. Like I like the ability to just take a variable and mutate it. I like mutating state. I think it's fine. There's a lot of people who think that immutable code is the best type of code. But as you see with React, there's a lot of additional cognitive overhead of just modifying something. You have to like do all those ... on your objects, and then like, I don't know. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. If not, you probably won't understand what I'm talking about. But so this is kind of like why it all led to like this little make controller function that I had in that video. I wanted a function that had all the logic kind of, abstracted away and inside of a separate like exportable function that I can test with unit tests and jest. And this is really heavily on dependency injection. So everything that this controller would depend on, whether it be like API calls or some type of like, I don't know, React query mutate methods, those would be passed in using dependency injection, which allows it to be more easily mocked out during your tests. You don't have to do a bunch of like jest.mocks anymore. You can just change whatever you want in your test file, right? You like, if you don't want to have this onConfirm do something inside your test file, you would basically just, I don't know, pass what you want. So this is the approach I'm taking, where basically it's a combination of like all these different approaches, right? Like it kind of reminds me of Mobx, where you have methods and those methods modify state. The only difference between this and Mobx is that it's using, I guess, a proxy under the hood, and it's not using the class keyword. It's not using this everywhere. It's just basically you have a model that's passed in, you modify that model with your methods, and that is going to re-render your React components as you make changes. And again, like all these other state management libraries are probably really easy to unit test. I haven't really tried unit testing a lot of these. Like I'm sure Mobx is super easy to unit test because this is just a class, right? Just a JavaScript class, which means it's probably super testable. Something like Zustan, I don't know. Can I pull this into a Jest test and have it work? Or is it going to complain that I'm not in a React environment and it's going to crash? I don't really know. But the DevX experience, the developer experience for like having to call like all these set things everywhere, I'm not a fan of it. Like this is kind of ugly in my opinion. So that's why I don't really have a strong opinion towards Zustan. Mobx seems like it's pretty legit. I might start using this for real and see how it does. I've heard good things about Mobx and people seem like they really like it, especially people who are kind of big into TypeScript and object-oriented programming. I think it makes sense for them. This one, I don't see a point to unless you just have like a really small piece of state you need to store somewhere and fetch somewhere. But in terms of like building larger applications that are more manageable, like, I don't know. I don't see like what's the benefit of this. Like it's not, you'd still have to like test the entire component to make sure stuff's working. So that's probably why I want to pick that. Context is cool. It's just super limiting. And again, like it doesn't achieve what I'm trying to achieve here, which is like separate all your business logic, or not your business logic, separate all your presentation logic into a separate file so you can easily test it and like abstract it away from your views. So that's why I probably wouldn't use context in that situation. And then I have Cerebral Overmind. Honestly, I'd probably use Overmind for any real large-scale project. I don't know how this hooks up well with Next.js at all. I haven't tried it with Next.js, but I am thoroughly impressed with Overmind JS, and I'm also impressed with Cerebral JS, which is both made by the same maintainer. So yeah, that's just kind of some information about, state management libraries in React, why we use them, why you might want to pick one over the other. And again, like the whole point of this video was just to kind of expose you to different ways that you can manage state. If you're a beginner, I mean, honestly, just stick to prop drilling and context because those are baked into React. You don't have to go learn about a third-party library. I'd avoid Redux just because it's so complicated. I know there's tons of projects out there that are still using Redux and Redux Toolkit. And maybe Redux Toolkit's a better approach now with these slices and you can easily like test them out. But yeah, I don't know. I used Redux in the past and it just left a bad taste in my mouth. So I'm avoiding Redux Toolkit as well because I just don't trust. I don't trust all the boilerplate that came with Redux. But yeah, let me hear your thoughts. Is there a favorite state management library you like using in React? I know this is like a hot topic. It seems like everyone has their own preference to state management libraries. But again, the whole purpose of this is I wanted to kind of explain to people who watched my last video that I've read up on these state management libraries, right? I've kind of formed my own opinions of how I would want stuff to be able to be managed and tested. And the little like quirks that I don't like about Zustan and what I don't like about Redux and stuff, that kind of is what led me to do my own thing here. And again, this is just for my side projects. So I'm not saying like you should do this approach. In fact, probably don't do this approach because I haven't actually tried doing it on a large scale project. But it's okay to experiment. It's okay to challenge the thought leaders in the industry because that's how progress is made. If you think that you have a better way to do something, then by all means, you should try to, do it. Try to do it, test it out, see if it works, and then just do it for yourself. Like you don't even have to try to get it popular and try to like promote it everywhere. Like just do what works for you in your projects. And if you're like a tech lead at an actual big company, then don't do your own thing. Probably use something that's more standard. Anyway, that's all I wanted to kind of talk about. Hopefully I taught you at least one new thing from this video. If you want to talk to me directly, feel free to join my Discord and send me a message. Or if you want to just get help with React or programming or JavaScript, there's a lot of people on my Discord who are willing to help you out. So if you have a question, if you're stuck, you want to share your code, feel free to join and ask your questions. Like always, have a good day and happy coding.